The Wright R-3350 duplex cyclone radial engine was an engineering marvel that had a nasty habit of swallowing its own valves and bursting into unquenchable white-hot magnesium flames. Test pilots and combat crews alike learned to deeply fear the very power plants that were supposed to carry them across the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Pacific Ocean. When the United States Army Air Forces committed to the B-29 Superfortress program, they essentially bet $3 billion, a figure significantly higher than the entire budget of the Manhattan Project, on an aircraft that was entirely unproven and seemingly actively trying to burn itself to the ground. This was not a refined, cautious step forward in aviation development. It was an all-in, desperate gamble to build an intercontinental weapon before the strategic reality of a global war rendered traditional medium and heavy bombers completely obsolete. To understand why military planners were willing to accept such terrifying engineering risks, one has to look back to the geopolitical anxiety of 1939. The concept of a hemisphere defense weapon was born out of the very real fear that Great Britain might quickly fall to the advancing forces of Nazi Germany. If the British Isles were occupied, the United States would have no forward staging bases in Europe from which to launch a counteroffensive, meaning any strategic bombing campaign against the German industrial heartland would have to be launched directly from North America. This grim strategic calculus demanded a bomber with unprecedented range, payload, and cruising speed, far surpassing the capabilities of the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator. By the time the aircraft actually entered production, however, the target had shifted from the industrial zones of Germany to the distant home islands of Imperial Japan. But the unforgiving requirement for extreme long-range performance remained absolute. Meeting these staggering operational demands required overcoming a cascade of interrelated aeronautical problems, forcing engineers into a continuous loop of solving one issue only to create a completely new vulnerability. To bomb from the remote bases of the Marianas, islands like Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the aircraft had to cover a round trip of more than 3,000 miles over open ocean, carrying up to 20,000 pounds of bombs. If detailed breakdowns of aviation history and engineering interest you, subscribe. I have got more of these coming. To achieve the necessary fuel efficiency and speed for this monumental journey, Boeing engineers selected the Boeing 117 airfoil, a high aspect ratio wing design that generated incredibly low aerodynamic drag while operating at high cruising speeds. But this highly efficient aerodynamic profile came with a severe hidden cost that the design teams had to aggressively mitigate. The wing loading, the ratio of the total weight of the aircraft to the surface area of the wing, was exceptionally high, which meant the bomber had to maintain a very fast airspeed just to stay airborne, making low-speed maneuvering and landing incredibly dangerous. To prevent the B-29 from stalling and dropping out of the sky on approach, engineers installed massive Fowler flaps that, when fully extended, increased the total wing area by 20%. While these enormous flaps successfully lowered the stall speed to a somewhat manageable 125 miles per hour, they required complex hydraulic mechanisms and absolute precision from the pilots, who were now wrestling with an aircraft that felt incredibly heavy and unresponsive during the most critical phases of flight. Operating an aircraft across such vast distances also meant the crew would be airborne for up to 15 hours at a time, requiring them to fly high above dangerous weather patterns and enemy anti-aircraft fire. Flying continuously at an altitude of 30,000 feet in an unpressurized cabin, as crews did in the B-17 Flying Fortress, required wearing bulky, electrically heated flight suits and relying entirely on cumbersome oxygen masks, leading to severe physical exhaustion and high rates of frostbite. To keep the crew sharp and combat effective on these grueling marathon missions, Boeing had to engineer a fully pressurized cabin, a luxury previously reserved for experimental aircraft and a handful of specialized pre-war airliners. This decision fundamentally altered the entire architecture of the bomber, transforming it from a simple metal shell into a complex, high-altitude pressure vessel that had to survive the rigors of combat. However, pressurizing a tactical bomber presented an immediate and glaring architectural paradox. You cannot easily maintain internal air pressure in a fuselage that features massive, gaping bomb bay doors designed to open in the freezing, thin atmosphere of the stratosphere. The engineering solution was to divide the aircraft into 3 entirely separate pressurized compartments. the forward flight deck for the pilots and bombardier, an aft compartment for the gunners and radar operator, and an isolated tail gunner station at the extreme rear of the aircraft. To allow crewmen to move between the forward and aft compartments without violently depressurizing the aircraft, engineers installed a pressurized crawl tube that measured just 24 inches in diameter and ran 35 feet right over the top of the unpressurized bomb bays. Navigating this claustrophobic tunnel while wearing a bulky parachute and flight gear was a terrifying prospect, especially knowing that a single piece of enemy shrapnel rupturing the tube could cause a rapid, explosive decompression that would aggressively suck the oxygen right out of the crew's lungs. Defending this pressurized flying cylinder in the thin, unforgiving air of the upper atmosphere created yet another profound engineering dilemma. Traditional manned gun turrets, where a gunner physically sits inside a rotating glass and metal dome, were terribly unaerodynamic and practically impossible to seal against severe pressure leaks. The groundbreaking solution came from the engineers at General Electric, who developed a centralized analog fire control system that removed the gunners from the turrets altogether. Instead, the gunner sat inside the warm, pressurized cabins and operated electronic sighting stations mounted in small blister windows using complex analog computers to control the aircraft's 5 remote-controlled turrets, which bristled with 50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm tail cannon. This analog computer network was arguably the most sophisticated electronic combat system deployed during the entire Second World War. When a gunner tracked an incoming enemy fighter through his optical sight, the mechanical computer instantly calculated a myriad of complex variables, including windage, gravity drop, the relative speed of the target, and the parallax effect caused by the fact that the actual guns were located up to 30 feet away from the gunner's line of sight. The system even allowed a single master gunner to take control of multiple turrets simultaneously, creating a concentrated, devastating wall of defensive fire with the flip of a toggle switch. Yet, the price for this futuristic automation was an incredibly fragile interior nervous system comprised of miles of heavy electrical wiring and sensitive vacuum tubes. A single, well-placed burst of enemy flak severing a main wire bundle could instantly blind the bomber's defenses, leaving the crew trapped in their pressurized compartments with absolutely no way to manually operate the jammed external turrets. As advanced as the aerodynamics and avionics were, the true Achilles heel of the B-29 Superfortress remained its highly volatile propulsion system. To haul a fully loaded aircraft weighing up to 133,500 pounds into the thin air, the Wright Aeronautical Corporation developed the R-3350 engine, an enormous twin-row 18-cylinder radial powerhouse that generated 2,200 horsepower. Because the aircraft was designed for maximum aerodynamic efficiency, Boeing engineers enclosed these massive engines inside incredibly tight, streamlined cowlings to dramatically reduce aerodynamic drag. This brilliant aerodynamic choice severely restricted cooling airflow around the rear bank of engine cylinders, causing the internal operating temperatures to rapidly spike past safe limits, especially during the agonizingly slow, heavy climb to bombing altitude. When these powerful engines overheated, the exhaust valves had a terrifying tendency to warp and snap, suddenly dropping directly into the combustion cylinders. The resulting catastrophic mechanical failure would instantly spark an intense fire that fed greedily on the engine's magnesium crankcase alloys, burning at temperatures exceeding 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. These ferocious magnesium fires were completely impervious to the bomber's onboard carbon dioxide extinguishing systems and could easily burn completely through the main wing spar in less than 90 seconds, causing the entire wing to detach in midair. For the flight engineers, managing engine temperatures became a desperate, high-stakes balancing act of opening and closing cooling flaps, meticulously adjusting fuel mixtures, and constantly monitoring cylinder head temperature gauges, knowing that a single moment of inattention could sentence the entire crew to a fiery death long before they ever saw the Japanese coastline. When these incredibly complex machines finally deployed in large numbers to the Marianas in late 1944, the high-altitude precision daylight bombing doctrine they were explicitly designed for violently collided with a completely unknown operational reality. As the bombers climbed to 30,000 feet to drop their payloads on Tokyo and Yokohama, the crews encountered a meteorological phenomenon that weather forecasters had not previously mapped or understood: the polar jet stream. These extreme upper-level winds routinely exceeded 200 miles per hour, wreaking absolute havoc on the bomber formations and completely destroying their carefully calculated navigation. Flying downwind, the aircraft reached ground speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, moving far too fast for the legendary Norden bombsight's analog mechanical tracking systems to actually calculate a dropping point. When flying upwind against the ferocious jet stream, the bombers were essentially slowed to a crawl relative to the ground, leaving them sitting ducks for heavy anti-aircraft batteries while burning through critical fuel reserves at an alarming rate. Consequently, the high-altitude bombing accuracy was abysmal, with less than 10% of the ordnance falling anywhere near the targeted industrial complexes. The strategic bombing campaign, which had cost American taxpayers $3 billion and required immense logistical sacrifices to supply the Marianas bases, was initially failing to severely cripple the Japanese war machine. The advanced pressurization, the highly sophisticated analog computers, and the aerodynamic sacrifices made for high-altitude flight were being completely neutralized by the unyielding forces of the Pacific weather. Knowing what you now know about its historical performance and the incredible meteorological challenges of the jet stream, do you think this high-altitude design approach was the right call for its era? Or should engineers have focused on simpler, low-level platforms? Share your thoughts below. Faced with the total failure of the precision doctrine, General Curtis LeMay took command of the 21st Bomber Command and instituted a radically drastic and highly controversial tactical pivot. He recognized that the high-altitude capability of the B-29 was entirely useless over Japan, and that the Japanese night fighter defenses were virtually non-existent at lower altitudes. LeMay ordered his ground crews to systematically strip the sophisticated analog central fire control systems and heavy defensive turrets right out of the aircraft, leaving only the tail gunner for minimal rearward protection. By stripping away thousands of pounds of advanced defensive machinery and ammunition, he drastically reduced the overall weight of the aircraft, which inadvertently helped solve the engine overheating problems, because the heavily laden bombers no longer had to struggle to climb into the thin air of the stratosphere. Instead of high explosives, LeMay ordered the massive bomb bays loaded with thousands of pounds of M69 incendiary cluster munitions, designed explicitly to spark uncontrollable firestorms in the tightly packed wooden and paper residential and industrial zones of Japanese cities. The bombers were instructed to fly strictly at night, approaching their targets at startlingly low altitudes, ranging from 5,000 to 8,000 feet. This tactic completely bypassed the extreme winds of the high-altitude jet stream and dramatically reduced the strain on the volatile engines, but it placed the crews right in the deadly path of medium anti-aircraft fire and the unpredictable thermal updrafts of massive urban infernos. This drastic operational shift resulted in some of the most destructive and devastating military operations in recorded human history. On the night of March 9th, 1945, during Operation Meeting House, over 300 stripped-down superfortresses roared low over Tokyo, dropping a concentrated deluge of incendiary clusters that ignited a monstrous, self-sustaining firestorm. The intense thermal updrafts generated by the blazing city were so incredibly violent that they physically flipped several of the heavy bombers entirely upside down in midair, while the interiors of the pressurized cabins quickly filled with the sickening, unmistakable stench of burning wood, industrial chemicals, and burning flesh. By the time the sun rose, more than 16 square miles of the city had been completely erased from existence, and an estimated 100,000 civilians and war industry workers had perished in the blinding heat. This brutal, low-altitude firebombing campaign became the grim operational standard for the B-29 Superfortress, a deeply ironic fate for an aircraft engineered primarily as a pristine, high-altitude precision instrument. However, the original high-altitude design parameters found their ultimate world-changing validation in a highly secretive specialized variant of the aircraft, known under the code name Silverplate. These heavily modified bombers were meticulously stripped of almost all defensive armor and turrets, fitted with specialized Curtiss electric reversible pitch propellers, and equipped with a heavily modified bomb bay capable of carrying a single, massive, unconventional weapon. It was these specific engineering modifications that allowed the B-29 to operate completely alone, high above the weather and enemy defenses, culminating in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the aircraft named Enola Gay and Bockscar. The sudden end of the Second World War did not mark the end of the aircraft's operational life cycle, but rather the frantic beginning of its role as the world's premier nuclear deterrent during the early, tense days of the Cold War. The United States Air Force formed the Strategic Air Command entirely around the backbone of the B-29 fleet, keeping dozens of the bombers on constant high alert status, ready to launch retaliatory strikes against the Soviet Union at a moment's notice. The strategic value of this delivery system was so glaringly obvious that Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin issued a direct, uncompromising order to his top aviation engineers at Tupolev. He demanded they completely reverse engineer 3 American B-29s that had made emergency landings in Soviet territory during the Pacific War, down to the exact placement of every single rivet and aluminum skin panel. The resulting Soviet clone, designated the Tu-4 Bull, was an astonishing achievement in industrial espionage and manufacturing replication, forcing the United States to rapidly rethink its own defensive strategies, knowing the enemy now possessed an identical intercontinental capability. The profound influence of the Superfortress on the global strategic balance was undeniable, as both superpowers now heavily relied on its specific aerodynamic and technical architecture to project power across oceans. However, the rapid advancement of military technology during the Cold War meant that the undisputed King of the Skies would soon face an entirely new generation of threats that its complex analog systems simply could not counter. The ultimate twilight of the B-29 Superfortress, as a frontline combat aircraft arrived violently in the freezing skies over the Korean peninsula in the early 1950s. American bomber crews, tasked with destroying North Korean bridges and heavily defended supply depots, suddenly found themselves being aggressively intercepted by the Soviet-built MiG-15, a nimble, swept-wing jet fighter that completely changed the dynamics of aerial warfare. The sophisticated analog central fire control system, which had easily tracked and destroyed slower, propeller-driven Japanese fighters a few years earlier, was entirely incapable of tracking a jet interceptor closing at speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. Despite flying tight, mutually supporting combat boxes, the bombers suffered staggering, unsustainable losses to the cannon fire of the agile jet fighters, finally forcing military commanders to restrict the aging, propeller-driven behemoths exclusively to nocturnal interdiction missions. Looking back at the complete historical arc of the B-29 Superfortress, it stands as a monumental transitional bridge between the rudimentary, freezing combat aircraft of the early 20th century and the sophisticated, electronically integrated aerospace weapons of the modern era. It was a terribly flawed, profoundly dangerous machine that routinely killed its own crews with catastrophic engine fires. Yet it simultaneously introduced the fundamental technologies, pressurized cabins, remote automated gunnery, and sophisticated analog combat computing that define modern aviation today. The engineers who drafted its blueprints essentially forced the entire aviation industry to take a massive, painful leap forward, solving unprecedented problems with raw mechanical ingenuity in an era long before digital simulations could predict structural or thermal failures. If you found this historical analysis useful, helps more people discover these deep dives, thanks for watching.